So let's get right to it then. I think I already did that part. All right, so who am I? My name's Justin Bell. Like I said, I'm the audio director at Obsidian Entertainment. On Stick of Truth, I manage the team of awesome and talented sound designers. We handled sound design, well, I did. I handled some sound design, music direction, implementation, a very, very small amount of music writing. Most of the credit of that goes to someone else, and I'll talk about him in a minute. And I was also the occasional audio liaison between South Park Digital Studios and the audio team at Obsidian. I'd like to give you a little backstory, introductory backstory before I dive into audio specifics. 4 years ago, South Park came to Obsidian and asked us to make an RPG based on the show. Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of South Park, wanted a full-fledged South Park video game, and they wanted to be involved every step of the way. Their intention was to be more than just South Park advisors. They wanted to make the game with us. And they were involved. They wrote hundreds of pages of scripts. They delivered thousands of lines of dialogue. They had final approval over everything in the game. They were deeply involved every single step of the way. So you guys may or may not be familiar about Obsidian. We make role-playing games. That's what we're known for. And our role was to advise and interpret and execute Matt and Trey's vision, using our expertise as video game developers to design and propose and implement gameplay features from the prototype stage all the way to the final stage, and that was across the board. In terms of developing the game, we split the audio duties with South Park in very specific ways. So in terms of VO and narrative, that was all done by Matt and Trey in South Park Digital Studios. They did all the VO recording in-house. They have a fully staffed in-house audio team. They've got a full-featured recording facility there. It allows them to rapidly iterate when they're making the show. If you guys have ever seen 6 Days to Air, you'll know that their production pipeline is very fast, and this allows them to move very quickly. They also contributed some core gameplay and cinematic sound design, and at the end of the day, Matt and Trey had final approval for all the audio that was generated for the game. The composer for the game was Jamie Dunlap. He's been writing music for South Park since 2001. He's an amazing composer. He's incredibly fast, very diverse. He works ridiculously hard. He wrote all of the music for South Park: The Stick of Truth. There's a ton of it. There's well over 3 to 4 hours. I lost count a long time ago, but there's a lot. And he worked directly with South Park, Matt Stone in particular, on the cinematics, and worked with Obsidian on all the gameplay music. And he's actually here in the audience. He's sitting right there. That's Jamie. And at Obsidian, the in-house team did the rest of the work, basically. Looking at the picture that we've got right here, we've got Austin Shannon, that's me, Mike Dowling, who's also here, he's our VO guy at Obsidian, Zach Simon, and Randall Brown, rounding out the audio team. And we designed the majority of the sounds. We implemented all of them. We mixed the game. We took the VO that South Park delivered to us, and we conformed it and mastered it and formatted it for a format for our game. We had lots of freedom to do what we felt was appropriate for the game. Matt and Trey were very specific about the feedback that they gave us. They often only would provide feedback to us when they either felt something was missing or if they felt something needed to be tweaked to enhance the comedic timing of the content in the game. But more often than not, they were totally cool with everything that we did as long as it was appropriate for the game. So to give a little context to how we adapted South Park to a video game, I'd like to share some sort of high-level observations that we made about South Park and its audio. For the sake of time, I'm going to try to just run through these as quickly as I can and just dive right into the nitty-gritty. So the most important element in South Park is the narrative. The storyline is key for South Park. That's what makes it tick. Episodes are narrative-driven. Everything is extremely tightly orchestrated. That's what makes it funny. The brand of comedy is straight-faced satire. It's not slapstick, and that's an important distinction to make for sound. Slapstick sound effects are, very comedic. They're very classic sounding, Looney Tunes, Three Stooges, that kind of thing. That is not the style that they go for whatsoever. And it was something that we learned early on. The way that I like to put the comedy of the show is you take the most absurd thing that you can possibly imagine, and you present it in the most sincere way, to the level of just being completely naive about it. And you'll see the characters of the game, staring in the most sincere way at the camera, completely oblivious to the fact that the most ridiculous stuff that you've ever seen in your life is going on right behind them. And last thing is that the presentation is deliberately crappy, and those are Matt Stone's words. Those are not my words, for the record. And it's a very meticulous crappiness. They spend quite a lot of effort in making the show look and sound crappy in the way that it's known for. They're very particular about it, and as they should be. It's what makes South Park unique. Yeah, they work really hard on it, and they helped us a lot when it came to dialing that in for the game. So for us to understand how we can make a South Park game, we had to understand how the audio is used in the show, like how does it function in the show. So when we're analyzing the audio, some things were pretty apparent immediately right off the bat. First off, and this is the easy one, voiceover. It's synonymous with South Park. It's the same thing. Matt and Trey voice South Park. They often do multiple characters, male and female, in the style of Monty Python. They do most of the voices. They do have other actors that they bring in, but for the most part, you're hearing Matt and Trey. And that's the same for the game. Music plays a critical role, and it supports that naive absurdity, that satire that I referred to. The one thing, and this is a discussion that came out from talking with Jamie a lot, was that the music is always played straight. So, for example, if there's a very serious or sad moment in the show, it doesn't matter how absurd it is, the music is going to be sad, and that's what makes it funny. Those two things go together. And here's a perfect example of that from a recent episode.
What do you want?
Once upon a time, there was a little hobbit who lived in the forest. And all the hobbit ever wanted was to be beautiful. And even though she was short and fat and hairy, this little hobbit dreams that one day she could be pretty like Beyonce. And then one day, along came a magic powder called Photoshop. And just like that, poof, the little hobbit was beautiful.
See what I mean? Music is played straight there. It's emotional because Kanye West is emotional. And in terms of sound effects, we discovered that most sound effects in the show share that deliberately understated quality as the art style. It's deliberately understated. It matches the visuals. It's not very sound designy, and that's something that a lot of game sound designers will try to achieve with their sound design. We always want to make the biggest impact possible and have the sounds be very kinetic and full of energy and exciting, and use creative techniques to do that. And what they do on the show is contrary to that. It's very simplified. And here's an example of that. Oops, sorry about that, guys. There we go. I can do this.
Will never prevail. Not as long as there are children like these who...
Now get ready for Jambu's next trick.
I'm totally wet.
So notice how small those sounds are. Even when the car is busting through the crowd, you know, it's not a huge cinematic sound. It's just some glass breaking and some people screaming. And it's all done deliberately. So understanding how the audio for South Park functions helped us shape our goals for the project, which naturally led to additional questions. But first and foremost, our goals were to make it sound like the show. If we didn't do that, then we would have failed in our objectives. We wanted to remain faithful to the show. We wanted it to be a love letter to the fans. In terms of style, they wanted it to be sort of South Park meets medieval fantasy, film and RPG influences. They talked a lot about Skyrim. They talked a lot about the Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, anything that sort of had that general medieval fantasy vibe. So to understand how to sort of adapt the show and make it into a video game, we had to ask ourselves some questions. Where does the audio in the show and the game overlap? What stays the same? What do we need to adapt? These are things that we needed to know before we could really move forward and remain faithful to the show. So here's a simple Venn diagram to sort of illustrate those differences and similarities and make them a little bit clearer. So the show, it's linear. It's 30 minutes long, and it starts and it ends, and then that's it. Games are nonlinear, and our game is particularly nonlinear. The show is predictable. Not predictable in the sense that you know what's going to happen next, but in terms of audio, nothing is left to chance. Games, by nature, because the player is controlling the moment-to-moment outcome of the game, are chaotic. And that leads to pacing. The pace of the show is entirely controlled, particularly when it comes to music. Games, the user controls the pace. The show is constrained by time. Games are long form. The gamer can stay in one single environment for 20 hours if they want. Characters serve the narrative. Characters in the game are, so going back to the show, characters serve the narrative. What I mean by that is that they won't have a character unless it's there for a narrative reason. But for the game, characters are there to flesh the world out. So you can walk around the environments of South Park and you'll see people there, and they're really just there to sort of occupy space and give the impression of a living, breathing town of South Park. Characters... So let's see, and then there's that understated style. The show it's a very understated style, and in terms of games, though, we're trying to engage gamers. We're trying to get them excited. We want them to play the game. We want them to feel empowered by the things that they do and to be engaged by that every step of the way. So typically with games, we try to stylize those sound effects and sort of punch up the excitement level. It depends on the game. I know that this is, I'm just speaking in generalities, of course, but generally speaking, that's the objective. We want to engage the player somehow. And then there are two things that just don't exist at all in the show, and that's exploration. The player can wander around the environments and do whatever they want. They can open drawers and look at paintings on the walls and basically take their time enjoying the game at their own leisure. And there's no such thing in the show. And same thing for combat. There is fighting in the show, but it's not controlled by the user. So those are two things that would factor in when we were developing the sound for the game. Now, in terms of similarities, the story is key for both the show and the game. Matt and Trey, obviously, their involvement is the same, and that's what makes it South Park. We have lots of cinematics in the game. I can't recall. I think it's around 2 hours, perhaps more, maybe 3 hours. 2 hours. I'm getting a little signal from a fellow Obsidianite over there. Jamie Dunlap, of course, his involvement was pretty critical. He's been involved with the show for so long, it's impossible to separate the two things from that perspective. And also the importance of music in terms of the show and the game. Music was critical to nailing the aesthetic of the audio. So, as you can see, there's a number of differences to reconcile here. And so we had to take some liberties. We had to gamify certain aspects of the sound design that had no correlation to the show. We had to figure out a solution that would feel authentic and pay tribute to the show while also feeling like a game. As I mentioned, combat and exploration in particular, we faced those types of questions. And it was a constant balancing act for us, as you'll see. So now that we understand what makes South Park the show work from an audio perspective, now I'm going to shift gears a little and dig into how all this applied to the actual development of the game. So to add authenticity to the game's environments, level designers and environment artists added a ton of interactive game objects to the world. That's just sort of just give the player a lot of optional stuff to do. The sounds we did for those game objects were ultimately the most like the show. And in that regard, the target was well defined, i.e. that deliberately understated sound. We had lots of freedom because of that. It's a very simple thing. What they would do is, and the way that they described it to me is that if they need a sound for a Foley prop, for example, if it's a pile of logs breaking, they'll quite literally just get a couple sticks and drop them on the ground and then call it a day. So it's quite easy to achieve those kinds of things. So in order to sort of adapt to the volume of interactive game objects in the game that were being generated, we assembled sort of a sizable Foley prop library to make that easier. And as you can see, that's a picture of it. It's mostly just household junk from just anywhere that we can get it from, to be honest. We would just, everyone's got that one thing in their house that they don't want to throw away, but they don't know what to do with. And so that's what this little library here consists of. And it was indispensable. I mean, it was the most direct way that we could possibly make those sound effects. You just grab something, you toss it on the ground, make sure that you're recording into your DAW, and then you were done. And for the most part, that was the case. Now, in terms of combat, that was the biggest gray area for us. Generally speaking, combat sound effects in the show are mostly understated, and we kind of had to think a lot about that. Did we want the combat in the game to equally be understated? Was that going to be enough to sustain a 12-hour game and make it engaging enough for the player? As you'll see, we asked that question along with many more. So in terms of the show, it's mostly understated. I think I've said that a few times. I'm sorry if I have. This is done to enhance the comedic effect. It's done to sort of enhance the fact that it's probably the most silly thing that you've ever seen. And here's an example, a couple examples from the show that sort of illustrate how they approach combat sound effects.
Oh, that's too hard. Lieutenant.
So as you can hear, their approach is pretty different for both ways, and they're clearly done just to make it as funny as possible. But is that going to work for a game? I don't know. We asked ourselves that question. Combat sounds in an RPG like South Park Stick of Truth need to provide that exciting feedback that I talked about for the player. Is comedic effect enough to support the gameplay? So toward the middle of development on the game, there was a big push internally to really punch up the excitement and level of combat. So Joe Bullock, who was one of the principal systems designers for combat, showed me this game that he was playing at the time called Persona 4 Arena. And what he really liked about it was how satisfying the audio feedback was for that game. We started talking a lot about brawlers and JRPGs and how they used stylized UI and combat sound effects to really punch up that level of excitement. And so just through the course of the conversation, we sort of randomly focused on 4 such games. And those were Persona 4 Arena that we had previously talked about, Soul Calibur 4, Final Fantasy 13, and Street Fighter 4. And, you know, these are all notable because if you listen to their sound effects, they're actually quite good and they really enhance the gameplay for those games. So we decided to do a little UI and combat sound effects prototype in the style of those games, just to see what would happen. We were still developing the sound of the game, and we hadn't quite settled on something that felt right, that felt appropriate for the game, South Park, and for the setting. So I talked to Austin Shannon, that he was the guy that was who created most of the combat sound effects, and I asked him if he could do a prototype in those versions, in those styles. And here's a video of that.
Fight!
And the value of that prototype wasn't really to say, oh, well, we should make our games sound like these games. The importance of that was just to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what happened. I'm a big believer that you know, a big part of making video games is failure. You need to know what doesn't work before you can know what does work, and this was part of that process. And it's a way that you can sort of fail in a way that doesn't really impact the broader production schedule. Had we just decided to choose one of these things and fully commit our resources to that, and you know, spend 3 or 4 months on developing that sound, only to find out that Matt and Trey perhaps didn't approve of it, or that it didn't really suit the combat of the game, that would have been sort of a bad situation to find ourselves in. So this was a way to non-committally explore our options. So yeah, it was a valuable experiment. I think that some of the elements sounded really cool. One thing though, it didn't really have that trademark understated crappiness, and when Matt and Trey reviewed it, that's the way that they felt. They felt it was too stylized. So, as I mentioned before, one of the games that Matt and Trey referred to a lot was Skyrim. And to see how that fit, what we did was we extracted the sounds from the pack file that they've got in the game, and we layered that over a video, and we sent that video over to South Park for their feedback. And here's a video of that. And those are just Skyrim sounds verbatim. We didn't really do anything. We just wanted to see how it felt. And as with the first prototype, they still were like, well, this doesn't really sound like what we would do in the show. You know, the way that they put it was that weapons and abilities shouldn't have a huge and epic sound to them. There should be no massive whooshes. There should be no auxiliary gore sounds. You know, it should sound like a kid took their mom's spatula from the kitchen drawer and whacked someone on the head with it. That's exactly the way that they put it. So, you know, what they were saying is that is that if they were going to do a sound like this, they would just do the simple Foley thing that they talked about before. And that's basically to just, you know, if you have a wood impact, take two pieces of wood, knock them together, and there you have it. So they asked us if we could try going in that direction, and I took a stab at it, and I went for the crappiest, most understated treatment I possibly could. I really had to hold myself back, and here's a video of that. So a little bit of embarrassing trivia here. So those flesh impacts were me just rolling up my shirt and just slapping myself on my belly. And they loved it, of course. You know, and it's a novel approach. You know, I mean, obviously, you guys are. You know, it's funny, and it's kind of funny the first time you hear it, and it's definitely more in line with the simple approach of the show. You know, what I felt was that we were sort of exchanging excitement for humor. And as I mentioned before, it just wasn't clear to me whether or not that was going to be enough for the duration of the game. So here's a little philosophy, my personal philosophy here, I guess. One of the benefits of the production cycle is iteration. You know, how I was talking about the need to be able to fail sometimes in order to know how to succeed, and the benefit of time is really the key there. It often shows you the right way to go, and so. You know, I think it felt to a lot of people at Obsidian that it just sort of felt like the understated sound effects weren't really doing the combat enough justice. You know, the visual style was sort of over the top and you know, stylized, and there were visual effects going on, and they were clearly trying to make it as exciting as possible. So we just proposed a new solution to South Park, and we just tried to split the difference between all the prototypes, with the objective of making combat feel exciting and engaging again in a way that was acceptable to Matt and Trey. And this is what we proposed.
Like my grandpa.
So it's clearly a lot more. It's a lot more stylized than the oversimplified approach, and they like that even better. And that's what we ship the game with. And so back to the analogy of the kid with the spatula. This is more like the kid with the spatula pretending it's a fire sword, and they're whacking the guy against the head, and it's lighting them on fire. And it turns out that particular concept works really well with the premise of the game behind South Park. All these kids are sort of pretending like they're engaged in this epic battle for the universe. And so it sort of works from a narrative perspective as well. Music. So yeah, this was a big one. We had to get this right, and Jamie and I worked together quite a lot to make sure that the needs of the game and the needs of the show were equally being represented. So one of the things that the player will do a lot in the game is they'll explore the environment. It's one of the primary gameplay features of a role-playing game is exploration. And as I mentioned previously, there's no correlation to that in the show. Music from the show always serves a specific narrative purpose, and there may be no purpose for the player exploring the environment. So the challenge was to find music that implied an overarching narrative, and while also sounding like it came directly from an episode. And so one of the most important pieces of music in the game was the music for what we internally called the hub. And basically the hub is the town of South Park. This is the area where the player spends a ton of time, and that means that the music in this area is going to be heard a lot. From scheduling perspective, a reactive score wasn't possible. We were dealing with a finite amount of time, and so what we really needed were excellent results, but we couldn't get to the granularity of reactivity. So the music needed to loop. As you all know, loops carry their own risks and rewards, and I wanted to sort of try to avoid the pitfalls that loops can inherently have, considering especially how much this piece of music would be heard. So Jamie and I worked together on a few approaches to this cue before finding the one that ended up shipping with the game. We started working on the hub music back when the storyline was still in development. There were still some things that were not entirely nailed down from Matt and Trey. The references to Skyrim weren't quite solidified there yet. We weren't really sure if that was going to be the direction of the game. So it was a little bit of an interpretation on our behalf to try to figure out what the right thing would be. Jamie just dove in and he's like, you know what, let me just give this a shot. I send him a video of walking around in the town. And in the spirit of iteration, we just let's see where we can go with this. And here's the first version of that. And it's a really good piece of music, actually. I really enjoy that music that he did. It flows really well with the movement of the player, and it clearly sounds like South Park, like it came straight from an episode. The cue was about a minute and a half, all told. The one thing that I noticed about it, though, was when you looped it endlessly, when I implemented it into the game and played it, over the course of a month, it sort of had this breathless quality and this predictable quality. And it had nothing to do with the actual music itself. It was just the fact that it was being looped endlessly over and over and over again, and that you spent so much time in this area. And so I sort of started to feel like it might not hold up after about 12, 16 hours of playing the game. So so I went back to Jamie. I was like, let's see if we could give this another shot. And for the next version, we tried a more specific approach, and that was just based off of my impressions from the music that he had done previously. So the idea was to create a loop that had longevity, and so there was a couple very specific things that I sort of keyed into that I felt that might help achieve that. So one of the things was to limit the dynamic range. No fortissimo. Just sort of keep it sort of small and in the background. Keep the ensemble small. Not full orchestra. Maybe duo or trio or quartet, but nothing beyond that. Leave lots of negative space between the phrases. Lots of air. So that there were moments where there wasn't music. And lastly was to sort of extend the length to be around 7 minutes. And I sort of find that to be the looping sweet spot. If you have a cue that's around 7 minutes, you will catch on to the fact that it's looping, but it won't, every single time that you hear that piece of music, you'll always discover something new, and you'll grow to love that piece of music. And so I sort of, I just sort of shot for something that was considerably longer than 1.5 minutes. And for style, this was around the time where Skyrim was sort of becoming the style that Matt and Trey were really honing in on. And so we sort of went with a lighthearted Shire kind of vibe. Shire's not Skyrim, but it's that medieval fantasy. And so we were sort of treating the town of South Park like the Shire. And so here's that cue. And then it went on for another 5 minutes or so. And yeah, I really dug it. I thought it was pretty sweet. Because of the length, the looping didn't really matter. The player would discover something new with each listen. The negative space alleviated that breathlessness that I had alluded to previously. It was on the whimsical side. It had a lighthearted quality. But that's not at all what Skyrim is about. Not about the lighthearted quality. It's a darker, more serious tone. There is light music in the game, but it is not that. So, as I mentioned, Skyrim was becoming the thing that we were talking about a lot, and so the new cue, while good, it didn't really fit the narrative as it was developing. So they asked Jamie to write a new cue based around Cartman chanting in Latin. In the game, Cartman is the grand puppet master of the universe, and so that sort of reflected that narrative plot point. And so here's a video of that cue. And as you can hear, it's darker. It still has that medieval quality to it, but it's definitely a darker treatment than the previous one. And I'll freely admit, I was partial to the Shire version, but Matt and Trey, they had the right instincts here. South Park is their baby, and that's something everyone on the Obsidian team recognized across the board and on every discipline. And ultimately, they know their show better than anyone possibly can. The cue was shorter, but Jamie did preserve a lot of the stuff that we had talked about previously, and he kept that small orchestration, that negative space in mind. But one thing I did to mitigate the shorter length was I implemented it in sort of a special way to address that. So whenever the music is triggered, it seeks to a different bar every single time. You only hear the cue start from the very beginning. You only hear that at the very beginning of the show when you of the game when you leave Cartman's house after the opening tutorials, and when you load a save. Those are the only two times the cue will start over from the beginning. When you go from an interior to an exterior, or when you leave the environment and come back, it'll always seek to a new bar, and that sort of helps keep the player on their toes in terms of predictability. So the hub went through the most iterations because it was the most important. But subsequent exploration music maintained the qualities of version 2, all those qualities that I mentioned, and they were usually approved without very many changes. So the show has that tightly orchestrated music, and so Matt Stone in particular was very keen on trying to preserve as much of that as possible. Comedic timing is critical to the show's writing as it is to the game. So even though we couldn't choreograph the music to the same level as the show, there were simple things that we could do to imply that. So so what we could change the default, for example, we could change the default exploration music to match the narrative, and that's one of the things that we did to sort of imply that there was some scripting going on there. Quest objectives in the game are often bridged by either combat or a cinematic or both. There's always that in between sort of a plot twist or shift. And combat and cinematics always had unique music. So it was easy to take those moments to mask the transitions in the music. There were no hard cuts between two contrasting pieces of music. There was no need really to try to figure out a transition piece of music. There was already this sort of contrasting game state that easily masked the fact that we were going from these very different pieces of music. So, and the player can backtrack in questing through an area and revisit previous cells. So it was pretty important that the music on a global level would reflect that change whenever the music ended up getting updated. And so it's pretty critical for that global music for the entire area to update as well and get tracked when you were to save and load. For example, when you were to quit the game and come back to the game, if the music shifted because of a quest state, updated quest state, it was important for that music to be preserved. So. And there were some quest areas where as many as 10 transitions happened. So managing that and making sure that the logic for that held over was a big focus. So Onyx, which is Obsidian's internal engine, has a very simple but powerful data-driven global variable system, which basically allows us to track a certain stat across the game and call that the state of that stat and recall that, and so that we can constantly check it to see if that stat is getting updated for something. And that simplified implementation without really needing to do a lot of complicated scripting or having to get really deep with any kind of programming. And that's how a lot of that was achieved. So, voiceover. South Park moves very fast when it comes to VO recording. When they're working on the show, they can make modifications to the script. They can go down the hall, record the VO for that, and then put it on the FTP, and it'll be ready for the video editor to put into the Avid for Matt and Trey to view immediately. And if they don't like it, they can go back and tweak it. And they do this extremely fast, and they have to in order to sort of keep up with their own production cycle. And they get instant results from that. And in terms of the game, they would often send us anywhere from 3 to 6 deliveries at the height of production, 3 to 6 deliveries a day. Now, it was quite common for a conversation to change a number of times because they liked to massage things. They wanted to get the comedic timing of the narrative to be perfect, and before they considered it done. And to be honest, it was a bit of a culture shock for them and us. You know, when you're working on a game, the VO pipeline it's a much longer trajectory. You know, the narrative designers or the writers have to write the content, and that's a feedback loop with the designers. It takes quite a long time to develop that script and to be ready to go to make the investment to go to a recording studio and record all those actors. So often that happens towards the middle or maybe the second third of the project. And it's because games have a longer gestation period than the show can. And subsequently, if we missed something during the recording sessions, or perhaps there was a read that we wanted to an actor read and one of the lines didn't quite come out the way that we wanted it to, we may have the opportunity to do a pickup session or 2 pickup sessions at most. So for us, you know, our expectations for VO is this long-term thing that takes kind of a long time to materialize. In terms of implementation, the implementation on the game side is clearly slower. The designers have to script conversations. Cinematics designers have to animate and have to do everything that they do. And us on the audio side, we have to take the VO, we have to edit it, we have to master it, we have to implement it into our conversation system. We have to get it all ready so that it's in the game, and then the game has to build. So there's rarely going to be an opportunity where you can just drop it in and see instantaneous results. In some cases, it could easily be a week, depending on what the priorities of the team were at that time, before South Park can view the changes in the build. And so I think there was we definitely had to stay organized in order to keep up with their pace. If an update came through, we had to identify what changed. Sometimes it was straightforward. The line would be named the same, but it was drastically different, and so it was quite clear. This line is changed in this way. Other times the changes would be subtler. They would just read it with a different inflection. It wasn't always clear, and it was definitely an adjustment for both of us, for South Park and Obsidian. So that is the end of my talk. We wanted this game to be a love letter to the fans of the show, and our goal for the game was for it to sound like the show. And from what I gather from user accounts and reviews, we were largely successful in achieving that goal. I'm incredibly proud of the efforts of my team and everyone at Obsidian for their hard work and passion and dedication on this project, and it came out a lot better than any of us could have possibly imagined. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this talk. And I think we probably got a few more minutes if anyone has any specific questions about South Park: The Stick of Truth. Yeah, if you just step up to the mic, please.
It's not really a technical question or anything, but I'm just curious if you ever thought of releasing a soundtrack with all the original music that you guys did for the game at all, because there's obviously a lot there.
That's an excellent question, and Jamie and I have talked a lot about that. And I think Jamie sent Matt an email the other day, and we'll see what happens. Hopefully, it's something that we can do, because there's clearly a desire to listen to that music, and it's incredible music, so it deserves to be heard. Absolutely. All right. Well, I guess that's it. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you.